and gentlemen. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, good evening. I guess it's a good thing. Each week I look out and there are more people as opposed to fewer people. I guess I'll take that as the fact that we're moving. That's a sign that we're moving in the right direction. So welcome to our third in our series about debunking Jewish stereotypes. This evening we turn to another, I think, a very familiar one. And unlike the ones we've done the last 2 weeks, the blood libel, the horns, the notion that Jews killed Christ, although they're familiar, they don't resonate in the present moment as much as the stereotype we're going to look at this evening, that being the affinity or the relationship between Jews and business. The notion of Jews do business. Now, one of the things I mean by the fact that it resonates more, and I should be grateful to our president who gave me a nice soundbite to begin this evening, because you'll recall last year during the campaign, now President Trump was speaking to a group of Jewish businessmen, and part of his trying to mention that he's good at negotiating deals, he said, well, I don't have to tell you people about negotiating. You're very good at negotiating deals. Now, here's the thing about that. Here's the thing, because not everyone who heard that remark, and not all American Jews, not all Jews were sure or in agreement how to take it. Because you could say, if you are a supporter of his, you could say he meant it as a compliment. But if you're a detractor, you could say he is reinforcing a stereotype. So you see, this is a stereotype that not only has it been around for a long time, as we shall see, and not only is it something that Jews continue to contend with, but it underscores an element of stereotyping, and in particular, and including the stereotyping of Jews. And an important thing for us to, well, one of the things we'll note this week is that a stereotype is still a stereotype, even if it's not ostensibly negative. A compliment, or something intended or stated as a compliment, can also be a stereotype, and it can also, beyond its complimentary or apparently complimentary nature, can have the same ultimate negative effect as a stereotype. And to sort of really illustrate that, I want to introduce you to two terms you might not know. There's a family of terms which describes the way that people understand or relate to Jews or their attitude towards Jews. There's three words. Now, the familiar word is anti-Semitism. I'm going to assume we all know that term. Now, in its most specific sense, anti-Semitism refers to a form of a very specific kind of Jew hatred, which is racial and political in nature, invented by a German sociologist 150 years ago. But in its more colloquial and popular sense, anti-Semitism has become the catchword to refer to all Jew hatred, including things not specifically racial and political in nature. And we use the term somewhat anachronistically because the term was coined in 1869, but we use it to refer to Jew hatred going back before. So we call the blood libel accusation a form of anti-Semitism. Strictly speaking, it's anachronistic, but it's okay because that's the way we use the term colloquially. But we can also understand the term anti-Semitism as an expression of, as a way or collection of ideas underlying the way in which Jews are bad. Jews are evil, Jews are threatening, Jews are menacing, Jews are dangerous, a whole bunch of different ways of saying that. Now the twin, or the flip side, the evil twin I should say, the flip side, let's call it, of anti-Semitism is philo-Semitism. Now that word might be less familiar to you. The word philo in Greek means love. So philosophy means love of knowledge or love of ideas. Philology means love of texts, etc., etc. Philo-Semitism is the notion that Jews, unlike anti-Semitism, which says that Jews are exceptionally evil for certain reasons, it's an opposition to Jews. Philo-Semitism is a term which refers to ways that Jews are seen as being uniquely good. So someone who says, all Jews are good at business, and I mean that as a compliment, That's an example of philo-Semitism. Jews are well educated. Or there's another stereotype you hear. I don't know it from personal experience, but I've heard it and I've seen it in TV and the movies and novels where Jewish boys, when you date them, tend to be nicer. Okay, you've heard it. That's an example of philo-Semitism. Now, when we take anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism side by side, we look at them together, we group both of those terms under a larger term or overarching term called allo-Semitism, which is a term that might not be familiar to you. The term allo-Semitism simply means seeing Jews or describing Jews as inherently different in some ways. Different than everyone else. Now, allo-Semitism includes both the negative and the positive. So both philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism are subsets or examples or manifestations of allo-Semitism. And here's the point, and the reason the term allo-Semitism was coined. It's especially for those people who will hide behind the fact that something sounds nice and say, that's not a stereotype, that's not whatever, that's not negative, that's not pejorative, therefore it's okay. The point about allo-Semitism is when you essentialize someone Jewish, whether for good or bad, in the same way if you essentialize any group of people and automatically assign characteristics, it is a form of allo-Semitism, and even if it's meant as a compliment and sounds nice, it's still a stereotype. The one that always leaps to mind for me is saying that African American men are better athletes. Now, it sounds like a compliment, but there is a racist twinge behind that compliment. Same thing with philo-Semitism. And so when we look at this stereotype, at this notion, at this myth, saying that if you're Jewish, you are naturally drawn to business, commerce, profit, as we'll see, money lending, usury, that you're naturally drawn. In some cases, that was meant in a negative way. In some cases, that was meant in a positive way. We'll even see this evening a couple of examples where that belief actually worked to the benefit of Jews. Sometimes a philo-Semitic idea can help Jews in the short term, but the big picture is it's probably better not to have them at all. So I wanted to lay that out. I wanted to begin by laying that out. I also wanted to begin by illustrating not just how familiar these ideas are, or this connection, this stereotypical relationship, but how pervasive it is. And today, I would describe it as something global. But I don't want to just say it, I want to illustrate it to you. Look at your handout. It turns out that the latest manifestation of this philo-Semitic connection between Jews and business is coming, of all places, from China. In the last 10 or 15 years, there have been a slew of books written by Chinese authors, many of whom don't know any Jews personally, but they've heard these stories, or they've read about, or maybe they're familiar with particular Jews who have had success in business, and they've been writing about this connection. Let's look at a couple of short examples. Now, I wrote out the names of these authors. I can't even pretend to begin to pronounce it because Chinese it's like Chinese to me. So one of them, text number one, well, it's called "What's Behind Jewish Success?" Quote, to save, and this is talking about Jews as being good deal makers. To save time, Jews never beat about the bush in negotiations, as Chinese often do. Jews control the diamond market, since diamonds are valuable and easy to carry, which is ideal for Jews who are always wandering. That one is loaded, and everything in there, we'll be able to take a look at that tonight. Text number two. Jews are the most intelligent, mysterious, and the wealthiest people in the world. In a sense, not knowing about Jews equals not knowing the world. Jews are the ultimate cosmopolitanists. When Jews sneeze at home, all the banks in the world catch a cold one by one. 5 Jews together can control the gold market of humankind. The antagonism between the East and the West, in a sense, can be said to be that between 2 Jews, Jesus and Marx. Can't make this stuff up, folks. These are real books. Number 3. This book is called The 101 Business Secrets in Jews' Notebooks. There is a classic saying that the world's money is in the pocket of Americans, while the Americans' money is in the pocket of Jews. For smart Jews, everything has its own value, and everything can be regained except priceless wisdom. The most important point is Jews' attitude toward money. In their view, money is a gift from God rather than something shameful. You can get respect and high social status with enough money. Now, nothing in there specifically sounds like an insult, but the fact that you're making that assumption about all Jews is problematic. But I think the point of departure for us is the very last statement, where Jews think money is a gift from God, whereas other people, and as we'll see, Christians especially, they regard money as something shameful. And that, in a sense, is really the root of this stereotype. And for us, the best place to begin is to ask the question why, certainly in the Middle Ages and in the ancient world, until relatively recently, profit was something that was stigmatized. Money, or dealing in money, was something that was stigmatized. Even commerce was seen as a less than ideal occupation. Being in business meant you were somehow less virtuous than doing other things. Now, where does this notion start with? We can root it in 2 places. The first place we're going to root, well, first let me say that this notion, this stigma against money, profit, business, was largely a Christian phenomenon. We find it nowhere in the Islamic world. We find it really nowhere outside the Christian world, and I would narrow it even further by saying not only is this something of the Christian world, it's something of the European Christian world. Eastern Orthodox Christians, Russian Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, they had no stigma against money, against profit, against business. They had a kind of one against certain forms of money lending, but that was more the exception than the rule. This is something which is more European, which means until the 16th century, this is not only a Christian phenomena, it's a Catholic phenomena, because that was basically the church in Europe. And where did they get this idea? Well, the second basis, the second place they get this idea comes from the gospel. We'll get to that in a minute. But the root of this stigma against money and profit among Christians, and especially European Christians, is the same place where many European Christian ideas are rooted, and that is in the teachings of Aristotle, the Greek philosopher. Turns out that with the fall of Rome, most of the wisdom of Greek antiquity was forgotten. The one thing that was preserved, or one of the few things that was preserved, I should say more precisely, was Aristotle. The early church fathers and founders, they loved to read Aristotle for a variety of reasons. Alexander the Great loved Aristotle, and so his empire was sort of permeated with Aristotle. Philo of Alexandria was a Jewish philosopher who lived in Alexandria. His ideas are also very important to the early church, and they were very Aristotelian. So for us, the place to start in understanding this Christian stigma against money is with Aristotle. So what does Aristotle say about money and commerce and business and profit? Let's look at text number 4. This comes from his book called The Politics. Now first if you haven't read Aristotle's Politics, it's very good. It's very long. I always find it useful to recommend, if you're sort of a first-timer with Aristotle, don't try to read it cover to cover. It's very dense. Find like the juicy excerpts with commentary. Reading Aristotle in some ways is like studying the Talmud. You don't read the Talmud from end to end. You read Aristotle with some commentary. It's a good way to start. Not that I'm equating the two. That would be a good way for me to be declared a heretic by somebody, but that's okay. I should also say about Aristotle's politics is Aristotle had a very particular understanding of politics, which is not exactly ours. Aristotle defined politics as collective or communal ethics. So his ethics define the behavior of an individual. Politics defines the proper behavior of a community or a state or a society. Collective ethics is how Aristotle uses it. So look at text number 4. The acquisition of goods is then, as we have said, of two kinds. In other words, there are two ways to buy and sell. One, which is necessary and approved of, has to do with household management, acquiring what we need. The other, which has to do with trade and depends on exchange, is justly regarded with disapproval, since it arises not from nature, but from men's gaining from each other. Very much disliked also is the practice of charging interest, and the dislike is fully justified, for the gain arises out of currency itself, not as a product of that for which currency was provided. Currency was intended to be a means of exchange, whereas interest represents an increase in the currency itself. Hence its name, for each animal produces of its like, and interest is currency born of currency. And so, of all types of business, this is the most contrary to nature. What he's really saying is that buying something that you need is one thing, but simply trying to turn money into more money is not natural. Now, when he says contrary to nature, a contrast he makes elsewhere in a much more elaborate way is that there's nothing productive about dealing in money. Making money from money, you're not creating anything. It's the opposite of, let's say, a fruit tree. You plant a tree, you put in the work, you reap something you can eat. Money, you're not producing anything new. If you ever saw the movie Wall Street, there's a speech that Charlie Sheen, Bud Fox's father, the working class guy, makes where he's criticizing Gordon Gekko. He says to his son, he says, you've got to create something. You can't just make money out of other people's money. And that's really an idea that goes all the way back to Aristotle. Making money for its own sake, profit for its own sake, and especially interest for its own sake is non-productive, non-creative, and therefore it is wrong and evil. He goes on, he says a little more in text number 5. There are two sorts of wealth getting, as I have said. One is part of household management, the other is retail trade. The former is necessary and honorable, while that which consists in exchange is justly censured, for it is unnatural. And skipping down, the most hated sort, and with the greatest reason, is usury. Now, this term usury doesn't simply mean money lending. The definition of usury is lending money at an excessively high rate of interest, like a loan shark, charging 100% as opposed to 5%, or whatever is deemed unnecessarily high. The most hated sort, and with greatest reason, is usury, which makes a gain out of money itself, and not from the natural object of it. For money was intended to be used in exchange, but not to increase at interest. And this term interest, which means the birth of money from money, is applied to the breeding of money, because the offspring resembles the parent. Wherefore, of modes of getting wealth, this is the most unnatural. Excessive interest is the most unnatural, but he also thinks that profit for its own sake and money for its own sake is also unnatural. Now, that's an important early element of this stigma against business, profit, trade, and money, as opposed to more productive things like farming the land, or an artisan who creates something, or an intellectual who creates an idea, a writer, a poet, an artist. They're creating something. Money is non-creative and non-productive. Now, understanding the stigma, we start with that as a point of departure, and we overlay on top of that the Christian Bible, its negative attitude toward those individuals engaged in trade generally, but specifically lending money at interest, who deal in money. Look at text number 6. This is a short passage from the book of Matthew, one of the Gospels. This is the famous story of the money changers. Then Jesus entered the temple. And remember, this is the temple in Jerusalem where in one part of the temple, that's where they had the sacrifices, but the outer courtyard, a lot of business was being done there. This was the main thoroughfare of the city of Jerusalem. This was the economic center of the Jewish world where all the deals got made. Jesus, as it turns out, didn't like that fact. Thus Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who were selling and buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called the house of prayer." That's a verse he borrowed from one of the prophets, Beit Tfilah Yikareh. My house shall be called the house of prayer, but you have made it, the famous phrase, a den of thieves. Jesus places this stigma. Now remember, these are Jews who are in the temple, so they're not just nowhere, but they're defiling the temple with their money making, their money changing, their buying and selling. In other words, from Jesus' point of view, the stock market has no place in the temple. Similarly, text number 7, Luke, the Gospel of Luke expands a little bit. And this is also Jesus talking. If you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Don't lend at interest. Now, he didn't make up that idea. He got that idea from the Torah. The biblical injunction of lending money, well, lending money to other Jews says, don't charge interest. Now, in the Bible, it says you can charge interest to non-Jews, but Jesus is in some sense expanding that little notion. Jesus is basically saying you shouldn't charge interest to anyone. If someone needs money, you just give them money. Jesus wants to replace all banks with a free loan society. No interest, period. Now, here's the thing. In retrospect, we know that became a deeply entrenched Christian ideal. That became an important Christian ideal. This notion that interest is evil, but almost equally potent an idea was a more pragmatic notion that without lending money at interest, a society and an economy cannot function. So there was no Christian society, no Christian state, city, region, area, farm, estate that functioned without lending money at interest. This was a kind of Christian doublethink, where they knew this ideal, that they weren't supposed to have interest, but they also knew that they could not exist without it. They needed it, but they didn't want to dirty their hands with it. So you see where this is heading. In a Christian society, you need to have it, but you need someone to do it whose Christianness will not be compromised by it. So give it to someone, give that task to someone who's not Christian. Or certainly eventually became someone who's not Catholic. Now, in the European world, and like I said, this is where this idea is going to become entrenched. The most prominent, the most conspicuous non-Christians in the European world very early on were Jews. And so the idea of Jews lending money at interest, Jews being the money lenders, and I would say more broadly, Jews being those individuals who dealt in money, who dealt in commerce, beyond that good kind of commerce of necessity that Aristotle spoke about, who built that part of the economy. There was this notion that Jews should do it. Now, it kind of cut both ways, because on the one hand, Jews can do it without undermining their Christianness, without a Christian having to be defiled by money. At the same time, from a Christian point of view, we already think negatively of Jews. We already know that they're evil. Let's just let them do this as well. For Jews, it doesn't harm them at all. Now, from a Jewish point of view, Jews living as first a minority and then a persecuted minority, this actually worked out pretty well. So you have a Christian society that needs Jews to do it, essentially, And you have Jews who increasingly are denied the opportunity to do other things. And this is a crucial point in the formation of this stereotype, this notion, this Christian notion of a Jewish affinity for business. As we approach, let's say, I would say around the year 900 CE, there are fewer and fewer occupations that Jews in a Christian world are allowed to do. Because the Christian world, Christian society, and the Christian economy is becoming more Christianized. Let me give you an example. Till a certain point, probably around the year 500 or 600 CE, Jews were allowed to own land, and Jews were allowed to farm it. After a certain point, though, the ownership of land, or I should say the acquisition of land, was tied to the swearing of a Christian oath. Part of the transaction of acquiring land was swearing a Christian oath, which of course Jews could not do, and so Jews could not acquire land. Part of farming someone else's land, part of the relationship between the peasant and the lord who owned the land, also a Christian oath. Part of joining an artisan's guild after a certain point meant embracing not only the Christian oath that you needed to join, but the basically Christian nature of what these guilds were about. These weren't only crafts guilds. These were also centers of Christian piety. Universities, until the end of the Middle Ages, universities in the Christian world were basically Christian institutions, what we now call liberal arts. Until maybe 500 years ago, in most European universities, would have included, not only included, but would have been structured around something like theology. They were run by Christians, they were taught by Christians, the students were Christian, Jews had no space. So the idea of becoming a teacher or an intellectual was off limits for Jews. And we could play this game with virtually every occupation. But really, by the time we get to the high Middle Ages, around the year 1000, the one thing, the one occupation left for Jews was business, by default. And we reach a point where there is this disproportionate number of Jews engaged in business, because there's nothing else Jews could do if that's the only job available to you. Yes, there were alternatives. You could be a rabbinic scholar. Yes, you could do that. You couldn't be a soldier either, by the way, because military service also involved a Christian oath. So by default, within the first millennium of Christianity in Europe, Jews were excluded from pretty much every occupation. One thing that was left was commerce and money lending. And even within the realm of commerce, some forms of commerce were also off limits to Jews. It narrowed and narrowed. There's another element to it as well. There's a political dimension as well. It turns out in the Middle Ages, the privilege or the ability to lend money at interest wasn't only, at the same time it was seen as something stigmatized by the Christian world, it was also recognized as something of great value and great power. Someone who could create interest was seen as someone who could play a very important role. Now, that was true for a very specific reason. You may not know, in the Middle Ages, war was not fought the way war is fought now. War in the Middle Ages was basically continuous. It wasn't as large scale as we have now. You know that song, The Noble Duke of York? He had 10,000 men. Never. Maybe he had 500 or 1,000 men. Wars were smaller, but they were continuous, they were ongoing. Every spring when the weather broke, the soldiers would go out and fight. When the weather got bad, they would stop, and whatever they were fighting about would just stop for the winter. I guess it was like baseball. You couldn't play war in the winter. The other thing about war in the Middle Ages is most of those who fought were nobles. Knights on horseback were nobles. Now usually, the original title of nobility could be given to someone because, among other reasons, they would distinguish themselves in battle. But that title eventually became hereditary, and sometimes the son of a noble who inherited the title and the obligation to fight might not necessarily be a good soldier. He might actually be a bad soldier. There's no guarantee that, I don't know, a professional athlete's child is also going to be a great athlete. No guarantee, but you had these sons of nobles who became the de facto army even if they weren't good. What this eventually led to is the best soldiers were no longer these hereditary privileged knights, but mercenaries. Those who were soldiers because they were good at it. Mercenaries needed to be paid, and mercenaries needed to be paid in cash up front before the battle. If you said to a mercenary, if you win the battle, I'll pay you afterwards, you face the following risk. In the middle of the battle, your opponent could say, I'll double whatever he offered, and the mercenaries would turn around, and all they're doing is fighting for money, which means that sovereigns needed a steady flow of cash, liquid capital, which means they needed subjects who could produce liquid wealth for them. Lending money at interest wasn't only about money. It was the linchpin of being able to fight and win wars. It was a way to make sure that the royal or imperial or ducal or whatever treasury had enough cash on hand to keep those mercs well paid. And that placed an important, some real importance and a real sense of power on lending money at interest. And this further fed the reason or the incentive to make the Jews money lenders. Because you don't want to invest with this powerful task someone who can actually challenge you for the crown. You want to choose subjects who can't possibly have any aspiration to be kings. Which means, in a lot of ways, anyone Christian could aspire on some level to be king one day, because there were kings and queens and sovereigns who started as Christian commoners. So you didn't want to give them that power. You want to give it to a group that's a group of outsiders, a group that's stigmatized, a group that will provide this service without becoming a threat: Jews. Now, we've come a long way from that original stigma against money lending and giving it to Jews because it's stigmatized. There were some very powerful reasons as well. And I should add parenthetically, it wasn't just lending money at interest. Other tasks and activities, also deemed powerful, were reserved by sovereigns to outsiders. For example, the forging of metals, like making swords. Typically, blacksmiths, the best blacksmiths, would be imported from other countries. And their whole sense of security and their whole sense of identity would be defined by their relationship and loyalty to the sovereign. Similarly with alchemy, when people used to believe in the transmutation of metals. Magic, sorcery, all of these things were reserved to outsiders, as was lending money at interest. The point being, by a certain point, there was not only the notion of this connection between Jews and business and profit and money lending wasn't only a matter of a stigma. We actually came to be seen as something positive in addition to negative. Now that I got to give you an example. Look at text number 8. We're not going to read the whole thing. I want to read just a couple of lines of this, but maybe you want to take a look at it yourself. Text number 8 is a charter of privileges that the bishop of the German town Speyer gave to the Jews of Speyer. Here's the backstory. Before 1084, there were no Jews in Speyer. The people of Speyer, the bishop of Speyer didn't want any Jews there. Speyer was a very small town, but in the neighboring town of Mainz, there was a what's called a flourishing Jewish community. Mainz was wealthier. Mainz was a more interesting place. There was a fire in Mainz, and the residents of Mainz, including the Jews of Mainz, were looking for a place to go. And the Bishop Rüdiger of Speyer had the following idea, which he wrote into the preface of this charter of privileges that he offered to Jews to come live in Speyer. Text number 8. In the name of the Holy and Indivisible Trinity, I, Rüdiger, surnamed Husmann, Bishop of Speyer. And by the way, bishop doesn't just mean the leader of the church. He ran the town. He's like the mayor of Speyer, in addition to being bishop. Really, he was the Count of Speyer. It's called the Count Bishop. Here's the key phrase. When I wished to make the village of Speyer into a town, I thought I would increase the honor I was bestowing on the place if I brought in the Jews. Jews are good for business. Jews will turn the village of Speyer into the city of Speyer. All you got to do is bring in some Jews. This is an example of philo-Semitism. It's actually this stereotype about Jews not only being in business, but being good at it, unusually good at business and money lending, in this particular situation, works to the advantage of Jews. See, that's the trick with philo-Semitism. Sometimes it works well. Over the long run, not so much. Now, I mention this charter not only because it is an early charter, but 6 years later, the Holy Roman Emperor, Emperor Henry II, he gave a charter to all Jews who live in the Holy Roman Empire, and the template he used for his imperial charter was the charter of Bishop Rudiger of Speyer. So this notion, bring Jews in, and you'll have commercial and urban and economic development, becomes something all over Europe. This becomes the basis for kings and other sovereigns being willing to tolerate Jews and allow them to stay. That's the upside. Of course, the vulnerability is going to be if the money ever runs out, the moment Jews are seen as, or particular Jews are seen as not good at business, they're going to be kicked out or punished in some other way. And behind every single expulsion edict of Jews from every European country was the Jewish community, for one reason or another, had become impoverished and no longer able to produce and provide the cash that the royal or imperial treasury needed. So it's an aid, it worked to the benefit of Jews, but it also created a certain vulnerability. This connection between Jews and business, moreover, the fact that it was rooted in the exclusion of Jews from other professions or occupations, isn't just something we know looking back. This is something that Christian intellectuals themselves were very much aware of. Look at text number 9. Peter Abelard was, well, he was a Christian philosopher, a theologian. He was actually, during the First Crusade, he was a Christian who actually incited a lot of violence against Jews. But one of the things he wrote was called The Dialogue Between a Philosopher, Christian, and a Jew. And listen to what he writes. Disperse among all the nations alone. This is actually, in this dialogue, this is the Jew speaking. Dispersed among all the nations, alone without an earthly king or prince, are we not burdened with such great demands that almost every day of our miserable lives we pay the debt of an intolerable ransom? If we want to travel to the nearest town, we have to buy protection with the high sums of money from Christian rulers who actually wish for our death so they can confiscate our possessions. Even when they are allowed to exist, we are not permitted to own field, vineyards, not even a patch of ground. This filthy lucre, money, is all that is left to us. To keep our miserable lives going, we must charge exorbitant interest, which in turn makes us hated by those who oppress us. Now, Abelard is writing this to stigmatize Jews, and he does a pretty good job. This is not a very nice portrayal of medieval European Jews, but he is putting into the mouth of the Jew the explanation of why it's so. We are this way because we have no choice. Believe it or not, in the larger scheme of things, Abelard's depiction or association of Jews with business is more generous than some. There was an English folk tale written around the year 1200 called Gernutus, the Jew of Venice. Now, it's very long. I'll read just a little bit, but here's a spoiler alert. Gernutus, the Jew of Venice, was the basis of another very famous Jewish moneylender businessman from Venice, which we'll come to in a minute. Number 10, text number 10, Gernutus, the Jew of Venice. In Venice town not long ago, a cruel Jew did dwell, which lived all on usury, as Italian writers tell. Gernutus called was the Jew, which never thought to die, nor ever yet did any good to them in streets that lie. His life was like a barrow hog that liveth many a day, yet never once doth any good, until men will him slay. Or like a filthy heap of dung that lieth in a hoard, which never can do any good till it be spread abroad. So fares it with the usurer, he cannot sleep in rest. for fear the thief will pursue him to pluck him from the nest. His heart doth think on many a while how to deceive the poor. His mouth is almost full of mush, yet he still gapes for more. Not very nice. This is, of course, Shylock. Now, in the story, Gernutus, he lends someone money, and in lieu of payment, he wants to take flesh instead. And the character of Gernutus, this character in medieval English literature, continues to percolate around even after there are no longer Jews in England. In England, after 1290, when the Jews are kicked out, English people continue to read and enjoy the story of Gernutus the Jew. Even the young Shakespeare enjoyed it as well. And in Shakespeare, we have a kind of transitional figure from the negative view of Jews and business to a more accommodating view, or a less stereotypical view, perhaps. In one of Shakespeare's early sonnets, which he wrote before The Merchant of Venice, look at text number 11. Profitless usurer, why dost thou use so great a sum of sums, yet canst not live? For having traffic with thyself alone, thou of thyself, thy sweet self doth deceive. Then how, when nature calls to thee to be gone, what acceptable audit canst thou leave? In other words, if all you deal in is money, you leave no legacy behind. Your life is empty. Not very nice. But like I said, Shakespeare, who lived during the early years of the Renaissance, he was part of the, let's call it the English northern branch of the Italian Renaissance. One of the things that these Renaissance thinkers would do was rethink these older ideas. And among others, they began to rethink the ideas of Aristotle and how they eventually fused with the Christian Bible to stigmatize Jews. And while Shakespeare didn't really abandon it, in some ways he became more forgiving. So think about the difference between the character of Shylock and the character of Gernutus. Now, when you first read through them, when you start The Merchant of Venice, Shylock looks just like Gernutus. He's horrible. He is a moneylender. He's all about money. He's as concerned with losing money as losing his daughter. He's just a despicable person, just like Gernutus. He makes the deal about the pound of flesh and expects to collect it. But then at the end of the story, the very end of The Merchant of Venice, what speech does Shakespeare put into the mouth of Shylock? Hath not a Jew eyes? Shylock at the end of this story gets to say, all those things might be true, but I, Shylock the Jew, I'm still a human being. I bleed. You have no idea how revolutionary an idea it was for Shakespeare to say that a despicable Jewish moneylender, usurer like Shylock, was a person, was a human being. This was a major step forward, a seismic shift in Christian attitudes. Now, Shakespeare wasn't giving it all up. He does not turn Shylock into a nice person at the end, but he makes the concession that just maybe, Shylock is human. And this is Shakespeare being very much part of his age. Because other Renaissance thinkers, too, begin to think about this whole, not only the association of Jews with money, but first, the stigma attached to money lending and profit and business. Maybe that needs to be rethought. Maybe this whole stigma against Jews and this stereotype about Jews, maybe it's based on something which is not necessarily valid. To give you an example, John Calvin. John Calvin was a Swiss theologian. After Martin Luther, probably the major player in the Protestant Reformation. He, of course, is the founder of Calvinism, an important Protestant group, denomination. And like Luther, although he was less virulent than Luther. He wasn't as angry at Luther, certainly wasn't as angry at Jews as Luther was, although he did have his moments. He began to rethink a lot of basic Christian assumptions about the world, including usury. Calvin was the first Christian theologian, maybe ever, who asked the question, wait, is money lending necessarily bad? Are we perhaps understanding what Jesus was saying when he criticized the moneylenders? And look what he writes in an essay he wrote called De Usuris, which means on usury. Text number 12. We see that the end for which the law was framed, and that men should not cruelly oppress the poor, who ought rather to receive sympathy and compassion. In other words, he reread the biblical passages about lending money and said, the point here is not to outlaw money lending. The point here is to lend money in such a way which is kind. Even lending money at interest, Calvin said. Even lending at high rates of interest, not excessive, high rates of interest, Calvin said, as long as you're not harming the individual, as long as the people you're lending to, for example, can handle it, and you're not abusing the poor, it's not necessarily bad or wrong or evil. This was indeed a part of the judicial law, which God appointed for the Jews in particular, but is a common principle of justice which extends to all nations and to all ages. That phrase, in particular, is key. Calvin says, yes, we all know, and we've all believed for a long time, that Jews are the natural moneylenders, and that's one of the reasons we hate them. But if you think about this whole biblical attitude towards lending money at interest in a more broader way, you see that this was something that God gave for all of us to do, and God gave us the opportunity for everyone, Jews and non-Jews alike, to lend money in a way which is not cruel. And that's the important thing. Do it in a way in which you're not mistreating people. As long as you're not mistreating people, in other words, Calvin said, it's okay. Whence it follows that the gain which he who lends money, his money upon interest, acquires, without doing injury to anyone, is not to be included under the head of unlawful usury. What a thing to say. Wittingly, unwittingly, Calvin just took a big chunk out of that stigma against Jews for being the evil moneylenders, because now the question was, the notion was, this Jew lends money, therefore he is evil. You have to ask the question, is he doing it in a harmful or malicious way? Because if not, there's no reason to think there's anything wrong with them. Profit, money lending, it's all okay as long as it's not harmful or malicious. This was picked up even further by a French thinker of the Enlightenment. Now, this is a century or two after John Calvin. This is a guy, he has a very long French name, Charles Louis II Baron de la Brede et de Montesquieu. We just call him Montesquieu for short. He wrote a great book called The Spirit of the Laws. If you're looking for a long and difficult book to plow through, this is the one. It's an excellent book. One of the things he says, by the way, is that the political structure of a particular country is related to a lot of non-political factors like geography. England is an island nation, it became a certain kind of country. Russia is a vast nation, it became a certain kind of country. His main disciple, or one of his fondest readers, was someone named James Madison. In many ways, James Madison framed the Constitution around the ideas of the spirit of the laws. But that's another story. Listen to what he writes about this whole stigma against commerce and money. Text number 13. Commerce combats destructive prejudices. And it is almost a general rule that wherever there are gentle manners, there is commerce, and that wherever there is commerce, there are gentle manners. Now, if you ask me, he just turned a very deeply rooted assumption on its head, because before Montesquieu, maybe before Calvin, Christians assumed that everyone who dealt with money is evil and wrong and unacceptable, and Montesquieu was saying, no, the opposite is true. People who deal in money, these are the people who are the most mannered people, the most cultured people. Therefore, one should not be surprised if our mores are less fierce than they were formerly. Commerce has spread knowledge of the mores of all nations everywhere. They are compared to each other, and from this comparison arise great advantage. We owe all the misfortunes that accompany the destruction of commerce to the speculations of the schoolman, meaning the scholar. Wherever one prohibits a thing that is naturally permitted or necessary, the people who engage in it are regarded as dishonest. What Montesquieu was saying, you Christian theologians, schoolmen, who stigmatize those engaged in money, with money and commerce and money lending, you've upended, you pulled the rug out of civilized society. And by removing that stigma, this is how we can live in a better and more cultured and civilized society. And this is going to be an idea which is going to revalue the whole attitude towards business and trade and money, and work, obviously, to the great benefit of Jews. For example, Benjamin Franklin, text number 14. Very succinct. Remember that money is of a prolific and generating nature. Money can beget money, and its offspring can beget more. Just like Aristotle said, his problem with money is that it wasn't naturally productive. Benjamin Franklin says, no, money creates more money, and that's good, because we all have more money that we can use even to do good things. He just stood Aristotle on his head. That's the Enlightenment bringing a brand new definition. Now, what was the implications of this new attitude towards money for Jews? Well, there was an obvious positive one. It's not surprising that this revaluing of commerce and trade and profit and the Jews' relationship to it coincides very closely with states being willing to make Jews citizens. Once that stigma is removed, Jews all over Europe are a step closer to full acceptance. But there is a backlash here, because not everyone was buying into, well, not everyone, even those, there were some who, even if they rejected that older Christian stigma of money and commerce and profit, etc., there were still those who regarded the way Jews do it as wrong. In some sense, they built on Calvin's idea that the question you ask about Jews involved with money is not, are they evil simply because they're involved with money, is, how do they behave? Are they bad people? And, well, let me give you two answers to that question. Text number 15. This is Karl Marx. You've probably heard of him. Now, Karl Marx obviously was a serious critic of what we would call capitalism, because we're right now fully in the age of capitalism. Now, Marx believed that capitalism was a necessity. He was a great reader of the English economist Adam Smith, who talked about the free market. Marx recognized it as a natural stage in the development of the economy, but Marx was also its greatest critic. Basically, Marx said, Adam Smith, who lived about a century before, I agree with everything you said in The Wealth of Nations, his main book, but you're all correct, but it's cruel for certain reasons. Here's Marx's critique, in a sense, focused specifically on Jews. Text number 15. What is the profane basis of Judaism? Practical need, self-interest. What is the worldly cult of the Jew? Huckstering. What is his worldly god? Money. Money is the jealous god of Israel, beside which no other god may exist. Money abases all the gods of mankind and changes them into commodities. Now, that is a very negative and harsh appraisal of Jews. But we have to see Marx in two contexts. First of all, Marx was a student of history. He was aware of the background which explained why there was this concentration of Jews in the area of money and commerce. Certainly. Also, he wasn't talking specifically about Jews, or exclusively about Jews. He saw Jews as the epitome of a much larger problem called capitalism. And he knew that Jews weren't the only ones doing this, but they're just the exemplar. Also, for his reading audience, which was predominantly Christian, he knew that they had some familiarity of this stereotype of Jews being the money people. He knew that there were those who believed the reason Jews have advanced in society is they're the great beneficiaries, the great beneficiaries of capitalism. And because of that, to make his larger point, he singled out and targeted Jews as the epitome of the evils of capitalism. So, yes, Marx is talking specifically about Jews, but really he's using Jews as a kind of signal, as a kind of fall guy, I guess, for the larger problems of a money society. Now, Marx was not the only one who felt this. Critics of Jewish emancipation made the following point. Because oftentimes Jews were offered citizenship, the assumption was once Jews become full citizens and there are no more restrictions on what they're allowed to do in terms of occupations, Jews will move into other more productive occupations. Jews will become farmers, Jews will become artisans, Jews will do other things, but that didn't really happen. There wasn't that much of a, what we call it, a vertical shift of Jews from commerce to other occupations. Most Jews simply use the added status to move vertically up within the realm of commerce. So peddlers became shopkeepers, or shopkeepers became department store owners, or in the world of high finance. And for some critics, Marx among them, they felt that this was, in a way, Jews demonstrating an older, or proving this older assumption of an affinity with business. The fact that Jews became citizens and were still overrepresented in commerce suggested to critics of emancipation that there is something deeper and more inherent. But for us, and for historians looking back, we can offer a similar kind of expectation. Because the moment Jews became citizens, it so happens, this is the moment when these other occupations like agriculture and artisanship are in sharp decline. Farmers are being competed out of existence by industrialization, as were artisans. And so the notion that Jews, in exchange for citizenship, would embrace these other professions made no sense, because why would they embrace occupations which are in decline? The new occupations that Jews did embrace belied this notion, this connection of Jews and commerce. This is when Jews become professionals, doctors, lawyers, architects, engineers, teachers. There was a move. And remember, once upon a time, these professions were deemed creative and productive occupations. So the stigma remained, but the stigma was not as pervasive. There were those like Marx who were critical, but in some sense they tended to be a minority. It wasn't a universal condemnation of Jews. But I should contrast. Even though there wasn't a universal condemnation of Jews as money people, there still was the association of Jews as money people. In other words, we have a change. Once upon a time, the stereotype of Jews, all Jews being in business and good at business, was something more anti-Semitic. In the 19th century, it becomes something more philo-Semitic. Oh, you want to go in business with someone? Go in business with a Jew. They're excellent businessmen. That was the new, more favorable stereotype. But there we see more specifically the vulnerability. Because as long as the stereotype was still there, even though it was cast in a more philo-Semitic rather than anti-Semitic vein, critics of Jews, haters of Jews, could draw on it. Let me give you an example apart from Marx. Look at text number 16. This is an excerpt from Dostoevsky's novel, The Brothers Karamazov. It was known, too, that the young person had been given to what is called speculation, and that she had marked abilities in this direction, so that many people began to say that she was no better than a Jew. Because for Dostoevsky, the anti-Semite, that's what Jews did. It was not that she lent money on interest, but it was known, for instance, that she had for some time past, in partnership with old Karamazov, actually invested in the purchase of bad debts for a trifle, a tenth of their nominal value, and afterwards had made out of them 10 times. This is playing right on Calvin's distinction between good business and bad business. And here the stereotype for Dostoevsky is not that Jews are in business, but it's cast more anti-Semitically. Jews are corrupt. They're cheaters. They're dishonest in business. And when we take a criticism like Marx and Dostoevsky, and we find these things, I would say, relatively harmlessly percolating around in 19th century Europe. But in the 20th century, a situation where anti-Semitism can become something more virulent, these stereotypes, even though for over a century they had been cast in a largely philo-Semitic vein, could be seized upon for more demonic purposes. Look at text number 17. This is a speech that Adolf Hitler made I mean, we knew eventually this was going to Hitler. He made it in 1934, and let's listen to what he says. It was and you can see both Marx and Dostoevsky in here. It was the Jews, of course, who invented the economic system of constant fluctuation and expansion that we call capitalism. Let us make no mistake about it. It is an invention of genius, the devil's own ingenuity. You got to hand it to Hitler. He knew how to make something sound like a compliment, even though it was a brutal insult and a brutal diatribe against Jews. So where does it leave us? It leaves us in the 20th century, in the 21st century, with the stereotype is still pervasive. But the stereotype lends itself to a more positive and a negative direction. And I think maybe the most useful way to wind up tonight is to look at one more text. And this is one of my favorite writers generally, but also writers about Jews, and this is Mark Twain. You see, Mark Twain was someone who, he was not anti-Semitic, nor was he philo-Semitic. He is someone we could define as being non-allo-Semitic. When he looked at Jews, he tried his hardest, and he acknowledged that it wasn't always easy for him to do. He didn't want to see Jews as different. He didn't want to see anyone as different. Toward the end of his life, it's really one of the things Twain strove to do, Samuel Clemens strove to do, is not to see these kind of essential differences, including Jews. So here's an essay he wrote called Concerning the Jew, which was published in Harper's Weekly in March of 1888. And he's going to, in many ways, recap, draw on some of the things that we've said. Trade after trade was taken away from the Jew by statute till practically nothing was left. He was forbidden to engage in agriculture. He was forbidden to practice law. He was forbidden to practice medicine except among Jews. He was forbidden the handicrafts. Even the seats of learning and the schools of science had to be closed against this tremendous antagonist. Still, almost bereft of employments, he found ways to make money, even ways to get rich. Also ways to invest his takings well, for usury was not denied him. In the hard conditions suggested, the Jew without brains could not survive, and the Jew with brains had to keep them in good training and well sharpened up or starve. Ages of restriction to the one tool which the law was not able to take from him, his brain, have made that tool singularly competent. Ages of compulsory disuse of his hands have atrophied them, and he never uses them now. See, he's buying into the stereotype that Jews don't engage in physical labor. He was a work in progress. I am persuaded that in Russia, Austria, and Germany, 9/10 of the hostility to the Jew comes from the average Christian's inability to compete successfully with the average Jew in business, in either straight business or the questionable sort. In Berlin a few years ago, I read a speech which frankly urged the expulsion of Jews from Germany. And the agitator's reason was as frank as his proposition. It was this, that 85% of the successful lawyers of Berlin were Jews, and that about the same percentage of the great and lucrative businesses of all sorts in Germany were in the hands of the Jewish race. Isn't it an amazing confession? It was but another way of saying that in a population of 48 million, of whom only 500,000 were registered as Jews, 85% of the brains and honesty of the whole was lodged in the Jews. Now when you read it, on the one hand you see, yes, Twain sounds like he's being philo-Semitic. He's singling out Jews, but he didn't settle for this. In his sense, the aim was not to simply remove the stigma. The aim was to remove the stereotype. Now, it's a difficult proposition, and we saw at the outset that to this day it is difficult for certain people to do, but this connection between Jews and business underscores not only the tenacity of a stereotype, but the important challenge of trying to see past it. And this is a challenge which still exists for Jews and non-Jews alike. Thank you. Thank you very much.